November 6th, 1920, Pittsburgh's North Side. It starts with a rumor. Motorcycle detective Andrew Carciere hears that 3 men out of Ohio are drifting from saloon to saloon, flashing authority they don't have, posing as federal revenue officers, asking questions, sniffing around for liquor. That's bold. Too bold. Carciere heads for the North Side. He finds them in a saloon, 3 young men from Akron, watching, talking, playing a role. He doesn't move immediately. Instead, he telephones the federal building. If they want to pose as revenue men, he'll bring in a real one. A short time later, revenue officer Edward Lang joins him. The 3 men step out of the saloon. Carciere moves to stop them. They bolt. Their automobile tears through the north side streets. Carciere and Lang give chase, engines roaring, tires biting cobblestone. At one point, the officers find the abandoned car. 2 of the men have vanished. Then suddenly, at the Water Street end of the Point Bridge, the fugitives reappear, jumping back into the car like actors re-entering a stage. Now it's a full sprint. They race towards the 6th Street Bridge, then down Duquesne Way, then towards the Point Bridge again. The driver sees he's being followed and floors it. Carson Street towards the west end. Carciere pushes his machine to the limit. He pulls alongside once, jumps out, flashes his badge, and asks calmly if the driver knows the way to Steubenville Pike. The driver smiles. "Follow me," he yells, and slams the accelerator. The chase doubles back, a hard turn at Main Street, back toward the bridge. The wind cuts cold off the rivers. At the Carson Street end of the Point Bridge, Carciere finally draws his revolver and orders them to stop. The answer is a gunshot through his windshield. Glass explodes inward. Carciere fires back, empties his revolver into the speeding car. Lang leans out and opens fire. The men in the fleeing vehicle return shot for shot. Now it's no longer a pursuit. It's a running gun battle across the Pittsburgh Bridge. Carciere's revolver clicks empty. He doesn't fall back. Instead, he pulls alongside and rams them toward the rail, forcing their car against the bridge. The fugitives bail out. 2 of them, already bleeding, stagger up the bridge walkway. Carciere chases on foot. They stumble. Carciere drops his gun and blackjack. Then they turn on him. They grapple in the street. One of the wounded men snatches Carciere's blackjack and smashes it into the detective's head and face. Blood runs down his collar. Still, Carciere holds on, rolling with them in the roadway, refusing to let go. Meanwhile, Lang pursues the driver, who leaps over the ridge railing 15 feet down to the riverbank. Lang follows, grapples him, drags him back up toward the abandoned cars. By the time it's over, 2 alleged bootleggers, Charles Fortiker, 22, and G.W. Blossett, 21, are shot multiple times. The driver, W.A. Blossett, 28, is in custody. Carciere, bleeding from scalp wounds and lacerations, forces the wounded men into their own bullet-riddled automobile and drives them to the Central Police Station himself. Inside the station door, he collapses. All 3 injured men are taken to Allegheny General Hospital. Later, under questioning, the driver admits they were in Pittsburgh in search of liquor. He denies posing as revenue officers, denies firing shots, claims Carciere shot himself, claims they thought the officers were automobile bandits. But 2 revolvers are found in the car. Another, officers say, was tossed into the river as they crossed the Point Bridge. Carciere and Lang insist they have saloon keepers ready to testify. The trio had been posing as revenue men, attempting to buy whiskey and search establishments. 2 young men lie in hospital beds with gunshot wounds, one shot twice in the head, the other 3 times in the stomach. A detective bears lacerations across his face, and Pittsburgh wakes up to headlines screaming, "Wild auto chase from North Side ends in gunfight." November 7th, 1920. Not Chicago, not New York, Pittsburgh. And this, as they say, is just another day at the office in Prohibition, Pittsburgh. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your historian, Jacob Stoops. This is part 3 of our history of the Pittsburgh Mob, and before we go any further, I need to level with you. Last episode, I told you we were heading straight into the rise of Stefano Big Steve Monastero and his gang. We are, just not today. Because the deeper I dug into the early years of Prohibition in Pittsburgh, the clearer it became. You cannot understand Monastero or the gang wars that follow without first understanding the climate that they were operating within. There was simply too much here to rush past. When we last left off, Pittsburgh's Italian underworld had lost its center of gravity. Gregorio Conti had managed something pretty rare. Through reputation, diplomacy, and leverage, he kept the city's Sicilian mafia and Neapolitan Camorra operating under a single Italian umbrella. It wasn't peaceful, but it was contained. Then he died. And containment did not survive him. In January 1920, national prohibition went into effect. Alcohol vanished from the legal economy and instantly became the most profitable illegal commodity in American history. In Pittsburgh, as in Chicago, New York, Detroit, and Cleveland, that kind of money didn't unify anyone. It destabilized everything. This episode lives in that instability. Before Monastero consolidates power, before the gang wars crest, before the late 1920s names harden into legend, there's an earlier chapter, the first wave, the early Bootleg Kings. These are the men who recognize opportunity the moment the Volstead Act takes effect. They step into the vacuum between 1920 and 1925 and begin building fast distribution routes, political insulation, interstate partnerships. They are the improvisers at first, then organizers. Some accumulate astonishing wealth. Others make fatal miscalculations. Prohibition is still relatively new. The rules of the underground economy are not yet written, and that volatility rewards boldness as much as it punishes it. We'll touch on several figures who briefly appear poised to inherit Conti's fractured domain, but this episode centers on one in particular, an Irish saloon keeper turned wholesale operator, Martin M. Burke, whom local newspapers would crown Pittsburgh's quote-unquote bootleg king. Because Prohibition does not begin with a hierarchy, it begins with acceleration, and in a city already defined by industrial scale, ethnic enclaves, machine politics, and uneven enforcement, acceleration quickly becomes chaos, as you will see. This is the story of how the city became one of the wettest in the country, how enforcement struggled, how MASH hung in the air, how corruption blurred lines, and how bootlegging evolved from scattered defiance into structured enterprise. We are laying the foundation today because Monastero deserves his own episode. His rise and fall will be our sole focus next time, episode 49. But before we get there, we need to understand the battlefield he stepped onto. Now, before we go any further, a quick word for any new listeners. On this podcast, we don't romanticize, we don't sensationalize. What we do is dig through archives, police reports, court records, FBI files, books, and long-forgotten newspaper columns to reconstruct what actually happened as responsibly and accurately as possible. This is Pittsburgh in the early Prohibition years. Money everywhere, enforcement fractured, power up for grabs. Now let's get into it. If there ever was an American city poorly suited for Prohibition, it was Pittsburgh. As a side note, while we'll cover Prohibition on the surface to set the scene, if you want a deeper dive, I strongly encourage you to read Prohibition Pittsburgh by Richard Gazarek, one of the primary sources for this part of the episode. Long before the 18th Amendment took effect, Pittsburgh had earned a reputation, repeated in memoirs, newspaper columns, and later historical treatments as a, quote, shot in a beer town, unquote. That phrase was not decorative, it was diagnostic. Steelworkers finishing brutal 12-hour shifts often ordered what was known as a puddler's cocktail, a shot of whiskey followed by a glass of beer. The Boilermaker, a variation of the drink where the shot glass was dropped into the beer glass and allowed to settle, wasn't a novelty, it was a ritual. It marked the end of industrial labor and the return to civilian life. This was a city built on furnaces, blast heat, coal dust, molten metal, and rail. Alcohol was not rebellion, it was recovery. And that culture crossed ethnic lines. Irish saloons functioned as political nerve centers. Ward bosses met voters over whiskey. Patronage networks were maintained across bar tops. Election outcomes were often decided in tavern back rooms before ballots were ever cast. German immigrants shaped Pittsburgh's pre-Prohibition brewing industry. Western Pennsylvania had a significant brewing presence well before 1920, and beer gardens served as social anchors in German neighborhoods. Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, and other Eastern European steelworkers built neighborhood saloons that operated as hiring halls, informal savings networks, and news exchanges. The saloon was where you learned who was hiring at Jones and Laughlin or whether the mill would shut down next week. Italian cafes and fraternal lodges served wine and liquor discreetly while also functioning as community hubs. Social clubs were often intertwined with mutual aid societies, burial funds, and extended family networks. Jewish social clubs hosted dinners and meetings where alcohol flowed within trusted circles. And in the Hill District, particularly along Wiley Avenue, African-American Pittsburghers built a nightlife scene of their own. Excluded from many white establishments, Black Pittsburghers developed vibrant entertainment spaces that blended music, gambling, and alcohol long before the Jazz Age turned national attention toward the Hill. These were not fringe spaces, they were social infrastructure. Saloons facilitated employment, settled disputes, organized political blocs, distributed news from Europe, functioned as informal credit institutions, anchored immigrant communities navigating industrial America. Quote, "The saloon was an oasis and alcohol gave momentary relief from unrelenting toil," wrote S.J. Kleinberg in his study on working-class families. In many working-class wards, the saloon mattered more than City Hall, and the city's resistance to alcohol regulation had historical precedent. In the 1790s, Western Pennsylvania became the epicenter of the Whiskey Rebellion, the first major domestic uprising in the new United States of America. When the federal government imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits in 1791, farmers in this region, many of whom relied on whiskey as currency due to cash scarcity, and many of whom were veterans of the American Revolution, resisted. Tax collectors were harassed. Federal authority was openly defied. Thousands gathered at Braddock's Field outside Pittsburgh in 1794. Then President and former general of the Revolution, George Washington, personally led militia forces west to assert federal control. The rebellion collapsed without pitched battle, but the cultural memory endured. Whiskey in Western Pennsylvania was not merely consumption, it was autonomy. By the late 19th century, Pittsburgh had already demonstrated how it responded to alcohol regulation. When Pennsylvania's Brooks High License Act of 1887 dramatically increased licensing fees, legal saloons declined, and illegal establishments multiplied. By 1890, roughly 700 unlicensed saloons reportedly operated in Pittsburgh. Quote, "Pittsburgh is indeed built on whiskey," end quote. That was the verdict of Eliza Daniel Stewart, aka Mother Stewart, one of the most recognizable leaders of the Women's Crusade of 1873 and 1874. In her own account of marching, praying, and protesting across Ohio and into western Pennsylvania, she described a city whose economy and culture seemed inseparable from the bottle. More than 32,000 women would join that crusade nationwide, turning moral protest into organized political activism. Out of that momentum grew the Women's Christian Temperance Union and eventually the political infrastructure that would help deliver national prohibition nearly a half-century later. Regulation did not eliminate drinking, it drove it underground. That pattern was decades old by the time the 18th Amendment was ratified. So when national prohibition went into effect in January 1920, federal policymakers assumed legality would transform behavior. Pittsburgh had long experience suggesting otherwise. When Prohibition took effect in January 1920, it arrived in Pittsburgh as a legal event, not a cultural one. On paper, the country had gone dry. In practice, Pittsburgh's drinking culture had too much momentum, too much infrastructure, and too much political protection built into the city's everyday life. The Volstead Act provided the enforcement mechanism, but it could not manufacture local buy-in where none existed. And Pittsburgh was a city built on routines, industrial, social, ethnic, and political. Government reports in the early days of Prohibition would refer to Pittsburgh as being wringing wet and would say the following about the entire state. Quote, Pennsylvania is very wet and only the price is needed by those who want whiskey and plenty of it. Close quote. Within weeks, alcohol remained widely available. Many saloons simply changed their signage, not their business model. Some became soft drink parlors or private clubs. Others relocated to basements and back rooms. In working-class neighborhoods, the shift was often less a transformation than a reshuffling. The same clientele, the same proprietors, the same social role, now operating under a thin layer of plausible deniability. This is where Pittsburgh's Prohibition story diverges from the popular image of the speakeasy as a hidden, whisper-only refuge. In Pittsburgh, illegal alcohol venues frequently operated with such confidence that local commentary treated them as a running joke. They weren't always speakeasies in the romantic sense. They were called, quote-unquote, yellouts. Illegal bars functioning so openly that secrecy was almost beside the point. And that openness wasn't accidental. It reflected the deeper reality of enforcement in Pittsburgh, a city whose authority was fragmented across federal agents, city police, county departments, magistrates, and local courts, all operating within a political ecosystem shaped by ward leaders, patronage, and selective priorities. In 1915, just 5 years before national prohibition, the Christian Social Service Union surveyed Pittsburgh's Strip District and found 96 saloons packed into a space barely 3/5 of a square mile. Their assessment was blunt. Quote, no one need go alcoholistically thirsty in the Strip. Drunkenness is rampant and the district is polluted. Husbands and fathers drinking, carouse while their wives labor to support needy children. Close quote. That wasn't written by a bootlegger or a cynic. It was written by reformers who believed the city was drowning in alcohol years before the 18th Amendment ever took effect. So when Prohibition arrived in January 1920, it did not descend upon a dry city tempted into vice. It landed in a city already saturated. By the early 1920s, Pittsburgh was developing a national reputation for being unusually wet, not because Prohibition lacked statutory force, but because it never secured durable authority on the ground. Enforcement existed, raids were conducted, arrests were recorded, but authority requires alignment between courts, police, politicians, and the public. In Pittsburgh, that alignment never fully materialized, and Washington noticed. As early as July 1920, federal officials were openly acknowledging that Western Pennsylvania posed one of the most difficult enforcement challenges in the entire country, worse in some respects than Chicago. Federal Prohibition Commissioner John F. Kramer put it bluntly, as reported by the Pittsburgh Press. Quote, more whiskey and more beer are being sold in Western Pennsylvania than anywhere else in the United States. This flows over into Ohio and makes conditions very bad in the eastern part of the state. We have done some pretty good work cleaning up the suburbs of Pittsburgh, but conditions in Pittsburgh are not good. There is a situation there that is hard to handle, but we are after it. It is true that intoxicants are being sold in the big cities of the country, but we regard the situation in New York and Chicago as relatively better than in Pennsylvania, particularly in the mining regions. In New York City, liquor is being sold more or less openly, but upstate New York is not bad. In Chicago, liquor is being sold, but downstate Illinois is not bad. In Pennsylvania, however, our problem is not localized. We are having trouble throughout the state." Close quote. That comparison is eye-opening. Chicago, the city that would become synonymous with Capone-era violence, was, in 1920, described by federal leadership as relatively better than Western Pennsylvania. According to Kramer, large quantities of whiskey moving through Pittsburgh and Erie were flowing outward into Youngstown, Akron, and Cleveland, just to name a few. The problem was not confined to one ward or one city block. It was regional, structural, mobile. Pittsburgh was not simply consuming liquor, it was exporting it. Prohibition here became less about eliminating alcohol and more about structuring its survival. Who could sell it? Who would be protected? Who would be rated for appearances? And who would continue operating without interruption? And that is the central contradiction moving forward. A federal law demanding mass compliance colliding with the city where drinking was embedded in culture, labor, and neighborhood life. And enforcement by institutions that were divided, compromised, or quietly resistant themselves. If Prohibition in Pittsburgh had a soundtrack, it wasn't jazz or a speakeasy piano, it was work, the low constant labor of turning grain into liquor, and it left behind a smell that didn't care about secrecy. Before you see Prohibition in Pittsburgh, you smell it. Not the finished product, not whiskey in a glass, but the beginning of it. Mash was the first step. Crushed grain and water, often corn, sometimes rye or barley, cooked down, sweetened, then fed yeast so fermentation could begin. Fermentation is where the magic happens, and where the city got its tell. Yeast chewing sugar into alcohol also throws off heat, gas, and a dense, sweet, sour funk that can ride the air through floorboards and cellar doors. Distillation came after, heating that fermented wash so alcohol vapor rises at a lower temperature than water, then condensing it back into liquid. But by then, the neighborhood often already knew what was happening. In an industrial city already saturated with coal smoke, river rot, and hot metal, this new odor did not always stand out sharply. It blended. Not invisible, just familiar. Another layer in the atmosphere, the kind of thing people stopped remarking on once it becomes routine. But that smell mattered. Once the stockpiles of pre-Prohibition liquor ran dry and bootleggers began producing their own supply, the city changed. Not just economically, but physically. The air itself shifted. Mash has a presence. It is sweet, sour, and heavy. It clings, it seeps into stairwells and back alleys, and in a dense industrial city, row houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, boarding houses stacked with mill workers, storefront basements tucked beneath groceries and tailor shops. You didn't need a neon sign to know somebody was cooking grain behind a locked door, especially when the batch was large. When the windows sweated, when the smell hung in the hallway long after the cellar door shut. Because in the Prohibition years, odor itself could become evidence. In fact, federal agents in this period were able to obtain what were effectively smell warrants, using the odor of fermenting mash or raw alcohol as justification to search a property and trace the source of production. And once you understand how physical and invasive that process was, how impossible it was to contain the scent of mass production, you begin to see why raids and arrests could pile up without ever drying the city out. A contemporary Time magazine piece captured just how aggressively smell could be leveraged. The article argued that the mere scent of liquor on a container could be enough to incriminate someone. In some cases, officers claimed that odor alone justified entry and search, warrant or not. Whether courts consistently upheld that logic is another matter. But the enforcement mindset of the era is unmistakable. Smell could equal probable cause. And despite the lengths bootleggers went to conceal their operations, that smell repeatedly betrayed them. 1920, Monessen, Pennsylvania. Quote, The appetizing odor of sizzling ham and eggs and the aroma of boiling coffee were not enough, police say, to drown out the pungent smell of steaming raisin mash in the restaurant conducted by Gust Melonis, 909 Schoonmaker Avenue, Monessen, PA. And Melonis was hailed before the United States Commissioner yesterday charged with operating an illicit still in the cellar beneath his restaurant. He was held under $1,000 bail for the May term of federal district court. The rum sleuths in this instance were 3 members of the Pennsylvania State Police. Hungry, they entered the restaurant Monday and ordered ham and eggs. As they waited, they smelled an odor foreign to a restaurant. It permeated the atmosphere of the beanery strongly. The state police called the office of Prohibition agent in charge, James W. Connor. Federal agent J.G. Troutman was sent to investigate. He went to the cellar and says he found a complete still. Close quote. 1923, Pittsburgh's East End. Quote, a complete distillery operating in a garage in an exclusive residential district in the East End was dismantled by police yesterday while more than 300 persons living in the vicinity watched their operations. 2 45-gallon stills and 35 barrels of mash were reported confiscated. The garage is in the rear of a house on Stanton Avenue. According to the police, the men under arrest had been arrested some time ago for operating a still in the Hill District, and they are said to have moved into the East End residential section in an effort to operate unmolested. All cracks in the garage had been carefully filled, the police said, to prevent the odor of cooking mash from being detected by residents of the district. The smell leaked out, however, and the police were notified. Close quote. 1924, Braddock, Pennsylvania. Quote, the trained sense of smell of government prohibition enforcement officers yesterday resulted in the seizure of a large moonshine plant on the second floor of a garage at 545 Pine Way, Braddock, together with 121 gallons of moonshine whiskey and 171 barrels of mash. Close quote. 1925, Rennie Street, Old St. Clair. Quote, Acting Lieutenant Matthew McGraw's nose detected the odor of moonshine as he, with several patrolmen, was walking past a vacant house at 317 Rennie Street, Old St. Clair last night. He investigated and found in the house a 100-gallon still, 15 barrels of moonshine whiskey, and 30 barrels of mash. The still was dismantled, the whiskey seized, and the mash destroyed. Close quote. 1926, near the Polish Hill District. Quote, Michael J. Olazak, a member of the city police force, and his mother were arrested by Prohibition agents Saturday when a still, moonshine, and mash were found in his mother's home at 327 Hancock Street. A charge of interfering with federal agents was made against Olazak in addition to his being held on the liquor charge. Olazak, who reports to No. 5 Police Station, was arrested after he ran from the house. He made threatening remarks to the agents, they said, and even threatened to put on his police uniform and arrest them. Agents discovered the still when they went to the home following complaints that a smell of mash and moonshine was emanating from the place. Olazak, apparently not recognizing the men as Prohibition agents, took them through the house to prove, as they said he declared, that he had washed everything up with a hose. Close quote. 1927, near downtown Pittsburgh. Quote, in the shadow of the county jail and only 1 block from the city-county building, a large still at 639 Diamond Street operated 3 or 4 months before it was seized yesterday by federal Prohibition agents under Administrator John D. Pennington. It was raided yesterday because the smell of mash emanating from the building was so strong as to infect the neighborhood. 3 federal agents passing the place in an automobile stopped when they got a strong smell and raised the place immediately. A 300-gallon still was found in operation, and George Miller, 50, 14 Shingus Street, was arrested and held in $1,000 bond for hearing, charged with being the operator. The agents also confiscated 48 barrels of mash, 3 gallons of moonshine, 600 pounds of corn sugar, and other materials for the manufacture of liquor. The building in which the still was seized is 2 1/2-story brick structure about 100 feet in back of the county jail. Close quote. Now, put that in Pittsburgh. Row houses packed tight, boarding rooms above corner stores, garage doors sweating in winter, basement furnaces running hot, coal smoke drifting low over the Monongahela. You don't need a neon sign to know someone is cooking grain in a locked cellar. You need a nose. And sometimes that nose leads somewhere almost unbelievable. A city police officer allegedly running a still out of his mother's house. A 300-gallon operation working for months in the shadow of the county jail, 1 block from the city-county building. That is not a coincidence. That is confidence. Confidence that enforcement is fractured. Confidence that proximity equals protection. Confidence that even the symbols of authority can be treated as camouflage. In a city producing and exporting liquor at industrial scale, the sweet-sour funk of MASH becomes both signature and liability, the invisible thread tying together thousands of raids, countless arrests, and a war that quite literally hangs in the air. And when distillation is happening within feet of the jailhouse walls, you are no longer dealing with scattered lawbreakers. You are dealing with a system. Because Prohibition in Pittsburgh wasn't just chasing drinkers, it was chasing production. It was chasing kitchens, basements, everything ranging from improvised stills cobbled together from oil drums and copper tubing to large-scale distilleries backed by systematic operations. And those stills could be dismantled, moved, and rebuilt faster than police agencies, already fragmented and often at odds, could coordinate. It was not hard to get back up and running quickly. In fact, it was quite easy. Nationally, federal authorities understood the scale of the problem. The Volstead Act created sweeping criminal prohibitions, but enforcement resources were limited. The government lacked the manpower to police every border, every river crossing, every warehouse, every tenement cellar in America. Illegal production and distribution spread rapidly because the system was structurally incapable of total surveillance. So in Pittsburgh, the smell of MASH becomes more than atmosphere. It becomes evidence of a law attempting to police chemistry in a city built on density and industry. And chemistry, unlike speeches, doesn't wait for political alignment. It became a symbol of the whole problem, a law that existed on paper, in courtrooms, in speeches, while at a street level, the city kept quietly doing what it had always done. And next, we follow what that smell connects to, the stills, the supply chains, and the people tasked with stopping it. When Prohibition went into effect in January 1920, enforcement in western Pennsylvania fell to the federal government, specifically to the office of the Prohibition Administrator for the district. The first man to hold that position was J.W. Connors, and Connors did not lack confidence. He openly predicted that within a year, Pittsburgh would resemble a desert. Quote, "We expect to profit by our experiences of the last few months. We know liquor is being sold, but the quantity is constantly diminishing, and we feel assured that before another anniversary of Prohibition law is observed, Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania will take on the semblance of the Sahara, and that the whiskey dealer will gradually become extinct, to be spoken of in after years by the older ones only when relating past experiences to the rising generation." Close quote. That is a remarkable quote, not just for its optimism, but for how completely it misread the city it was describing. Because at that very moment, the atmosphere in Pittsburgh was anything but dry. As early as October 1920, barely 9 months after Prohibition went into effect, Reverend Dr. Charles R. Zanister, a prominent Pittsburgh minister and vocal reform advocate, was already sounding the alarm. Speaking to reporters from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, he did not mince words. Quote, "Pittsburgh ranks very low in the enforcement of the Prohibition Amendment. Matters are bad here." Close quote. That was not a judgment made at the end of a failed experiment. It was delivered at the beginning. And if anyone believed conditions would improve as the decade progressed, Zanister himself would disabuse them of that notion. Nearly 5 years later, in March of 1925, after meeting with the city's mayor and police chief, he again faced reporters. His tone was not optimistic, it was grim. Quote, "The conditions as to booze, prostitution, and gambling are bad. They are much worse than they were." Close quote. The reporters pressed him. Quote, "With what period are you making the comparison?" Close quote. Zanister clarified, quote, "With the early part of the administration. A real effort to improve conditions was made then, but since that time, conditions have been growing worse steadily." Close quote. That exchange is revealing. It suggests there had been moments, brief ones, when enforcement appeared serious. But whatever initial momentum existed had eroded. Vice was not retreating, it was consolidating. And that reality exposes the limits of federal authority in Pittsburgh. Police officers, speakeasy operators, ward leaders, and bootleggers often worked hand in glove to ensure that liquor continued to circulate and that the profits found their way into the right pockets. The reality on the ground quickly exposed the gap between federal rhetoric and local practice. In one case, agents raided a massive brewery operation, seizing air compressors, 22 500-gallon stills, and 16 barrels of beer, all of it being guarded by Pittsburgh police officers. As the raid unfolded, one officer reportedly quipped, quote, "What's going on? We're supposed to be guarding this thing." Close quote. In another instance, Pittsburgh police arrived at a raid scene and ended up in a physical altercation with federal prohibition agents. The breakdown was not subtle. When confronted with public complaints about lack of cooperation between city police and federal authorities, Pittsburgh Public Safety Director James Clark offered this response, quote, "Let the prohibition enforcement authorities make the raids and enforce the prohibition laws if they have any evidence. Nothing would please me better. That is what prohibition agents are for." Close quote. In other words, this is your law, you enforce it. So perhaps drying out Pittsburgh would not be as easy as J.W. Connors imagined. Connors would eventually be replaced, and then replaced again. Each successor arrived with statistics, press statements, and promises. Each departed having achieved roughly the same result, none. Arrest numbers climbed, seizure totals were published, but the tide of alcohol did not meaningfully recede. They were, in effect, paper tigers, armed with federal authority on paper, but lacking the unified local support necessary to impose it. Despite all this, the powers that be, going all the way up to the governor's office, would still talk a big game. But like any paper tiger, their promises didn't have teeth. In early 1923, Governor Gifford Pinchot, mindful of his campaign promise to drive bootleggers out of the state, appointed Captain Herbert Smith of the Pennsylvania State Police to lead a special prohibition enforcement squad tasked with cleaning up the trade. Pinchot warned visibility, aggression, results. Captain Smith made that posture clear in remarks to the Pittsburgh press. Quote, "We are going to use every endeavor to arrest the bootleggers, large and small, black and white, rich and poor. We'll produce them in court with sufficient evidence to convict. It will be up to the courts to sentence them adequately. I propose to keep a history of every case in every county showing their outcomes. These statistics will be available to the public." Close quote. The article summarized the squad's objectives succinctly. It was to make it cost too much to be a bootlegger in Pennsylvania. On paper, that strategy is logical. Raise the risk, raise the penalty, reduce the incentive, make it public. But prohibition in Pittsburgh was not unfolding on paper. On the street, bootleggers ran their own calculations, and the math favored them. The profits were extraordinary. Demand was constant. Enforcement was uneven. Convictions were uncertain. Fines were often absorbable. Political protection could be negotiated, and in that environment, the real opportunity cost was abstention. To sit out prohibition was to leave enormous sums on the table. So while the governor's chair promised deterrence, the underground economy saw arbitrage. If you had the capital, the connections, and the nerve, the greater financial risk was not participating. Still, by the early 1920s, a new and more aggressive figure would enter the scene, one that would come to define federal enforcement in Pittsburgh more so than any of his predecessors. His name was John D. Pennington. Pennington was not a Pittsburgh ward politician. He was not a former saloon keeper turned reformer. He was a former U.S. Navy lieutenant and a recipient of the Navy Cross for distinguished service during World War I as commander of the UCS Corolla IV. He entered Pittsburgh not as a product of its political machine, but as an appointee, an outsider stepping into a city whose power structures were deeply defined by insider networks. And that distinction would matter, not because it suddenly aligned the courts or converted ward leaders into reformers, but because Pennington was different. He couldn't be converted, he couldn't be bought. In surviving photographs from the early 1920s, Pennington appears to be in his late 40s or early 50s. He wears conservative, dark suits typical of federal officials of his era, high, stiff collars, tightly knotted tie, clean lapels, and structured shoulders, his hair neatly parted and combed back, thinning slightly at the temples, clean-shaven, narrow face, high forehead. His expression in most images is restrained, not theatrical, not charismatic. He looks like a man who believes in procedure. His posture is upright and formal. There's nothing flamboyant about him. He carries the bearing of a bureaucrat accustomed to hierarchy, disciplined, measured, serious, and aggressive. If you saw him walking into the Federal Building in downtown Pittsburgh in the mid-1920s, you would not mistake him for a political fixer or a club owner. You would recognize him immediately as the government. Because Prohibition in Pittsburgh was not simply a legal issue, it was a cultural collision, and Pennington represented the federal side of that collision. Contemporary accounts and later summaries consistently describe John D. Pennington as energetic, even relentless in his early enforcement efforts. Where Connors had projected optimism, Pennington projected resolve. Where earlier administrators issued promises, Pennington issued orders. Under his watch, raids did not merely continue, they intensified. Operations became more coordinated, seizures grew larger, enforcement actions became more aggressive and more frequent. If Pittsburgh was not going to cooperate culturally, Pennington would attempt to overwhelm it administratively. And the numbers reflected that escalation. Raids increased sharply under his administration. Federal agents targeted illegal breweries, large-scale distilling operations, and well-known drinking establishments. Warehouses were stormed, equipment was smashed, arrest photos were staged for newspapers. Truckloads of liquor were confiscated in highly publicized sweeps. Across the Prohibition era in western Pennsylvania, the totals are substantial. Approximately 15,000 raids conducted, more than 18,000 arrests. Thousands of stills dismantled, hundreds of illicit or wildcat breweries shut down. Much of that activity occurred during Pennington's tenure between roughly 1926 and 1930. During those years alone, federal records credit his office with 17,000 violators arrested, more than 32,000 distilleries closed, 4,500 stills destroyed, 3.4 million gallons of mash seized, along with 8,000 gallons of moonshine and 113,000 gallons of alcohol. Additionally, and perhaps most striking, officials claimed that the number of speakeasies was reduced from 522 to just 9 between 1926 and 1930, though by the mid-1920s that number sat around 2,000 speaks across the city. On paper, that is extraordinary. These were not symbolic gestures. They were sustained enforcement campaigns carried out at scale. By any administrative metric, Pennington was active, aggressive, productive, but enforcement statistics do not measure cultural compliance. They measure effort. And effort is not the same thing as victory, because while federal agents were smashing stills, local police were still being accused of tipping off operators. While arrests mounted, juries remained reluctant to convict their neighbors. While warehouses were raided, ward leaders negotiated which establishments would be sacrificed and which would be spared. Fines were absorbed as business expenses. Protection systems adapted. Pennington could raid, he could seize, he could arrest, but he could not rewire the political incentives of the city. Pennington's authority was federal. Pittsburgh's political culture was local. The city functioned through ward leaders' patronage systems, ethnic alliances, and long-standing arrangements between police officers and neighborhood power brokers. Federal agents could conduct raids, they could seize liquor, they could arrest violators, but prosecutions depended on local courts. Convictions depended on juries, and those juries were drawn from communities where drinking remained normalized, even quietly defended. Cases brought forward by Pennington's office often stalled in the courtroom. Judges dismissed charges on technical grounds. Juries hesitated to convict neighbors. Fines, when imposed, were frequently modest. One judge's remark captured the frustration of enforcement. Quote, "Trying to enforce prohibition in Pittsburgh was like trying to dam the Allegheny with a broom." Close quote. That metaphor is telling. You can push against the current for a moment, but the water keeps coming. And that is exactly what the enforcement totals suggest. If 15,000 raids and 18,000 arrests had been producing lasting deterrence, the city would not have simultaneously supported an estimated 2,000 speakeasies operating by the mid-1920s in a city of roughly 500,000 people. That is one speakeasy for every 250 residents, and that figure does not even account for the smaller backroom stills scattered across row house basements, boarding houses, rural sheds, the countryside farms throughout western Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. Those figures sit in tension with one another. They represent effort but not authority, activity but not alignment, motion but not compliance. Contemporary reporting in Pittsburgh during the mid-1920s repeatedly described protection systems in which ward leaders and officers received payments to ensure certain locations were left alone or at least warned before enforcement action. The 1926 Pittsburgh Post Vice investigation did not describe isolated incidents. It described patterns. It spoke of illegal venues operating confidently, some even run by individuals with political connections. One notorious example, the gambling and boozing club atop the Kenyon Theater. That kind of operation does not survive on luck. It survives on insulation, and when protection payments become predictable, enforcement becomes selective. John D. Pennington was tasked with enforcing a national moral reform in a city that did not culturally consent to it, and his authority stopped precisely where local institutions began. He did not control the city police hierarchy. He did not control the ward political machines. He did not control the magistrates who dismissed cases. He did not control jury pools reluctant to convict. He did not control the long-standing relationship between saloon culture and neighborhood life. He could raid, he could seize, he could arrest, but enforcement at scale requires alignment across police, courts, politicians, and public will. In Pittsburgh, that never fully materialized. A federal officer later summarized the dilemma bluntly. Quote, "You cannot enforce prohibition in Pittsburgh without first enforcing it on the police and the politicians." Close quote. That was not rhetorical flourish, it was a diagnosis. Pennington's administration illustrates the broader prohibition problem. Enforcement energy was real, institutional unity was not. Raids produced headlines, arrests produced statistics, but illegal liquor remained widely available, and that contradiction between visible effort and invisible failure did not go unnoticed. As Pennington's enforcement campaigns intensified and began to threaten entrenched interests, political resistance mounted. When his results became aggressive enough to alarm corrupt local politicians, pressure was applied upward. Eventually, he was reassigned. In his farewell address in November of 1929, before leaving for his new post, Pennington made his frustration unmistakable. He asserted that authorities of Allegheny County and Pittsburgh not only failed to aid the enforcement of prohibition, but actually protected the bootleggers, quote, "up to the point of murder," close quote. He did not soften his language. In June of 1930, again on his way out, he expanded on that critique. Quote, "The unholy alliance between corrupt politics and the underworld fosters our present lawlessness. I venture the thought in connection with the present situation regarding law enforcement that we do not need additional laws, we do not need additional courts or judges, and we do not need additional district attorneys or prohibition administrators. Where honest and law-abiding citizens are in control of government, our laws are reasonably effective and enforced. The power to make a community law abiding rests in the hands of the elective officers, and the driving power behind these officials is the ballot box. There is entirely too much trading and fixing being engaged in by district attorneys and other prosecuting officers. Puny fines and sentences utterly fail as a deterrent to crime, and judges responsible are miserably negligent to their duty to properly protect and safeguard society. Close quote. The failure of Prohibition in Pittsburgh was not accidental, it was structural. Pennington could raid, he could seize, he could arrest, but enforcement did not occur in a vacuum. It operated inside a political and cultural ecosystem that resisted it at nearly every level. Start with the most basic reality. Local police officers were not highly paid men. City patrolmen and county deputies earned modest wages, worked long hours, and patrolled neighborhoods where drinking remained socially normal. They lived among the very people they were supposed to police. Now place that officer in a ward where multiple illegal establishments operate openly, each generating steady cash flow and each willing to pay for warning, tolerance, or selective blindness. That environment does not require cinematic corruption. It encourages routine accommodation. Contemporary reporting throughout the mid-1920s described protection systems in which ward leaders and officers received payments to ensure certain locations were left undisturbed, or at least alerted before federal action. Enforcement was not absent, it was filtered. At the same time, Prohibition lacked cultural legitimacy. This was not a frontier town reluctantly accepting reform. It was an industrial city whose drinking traditions predated the Republic itself. Jurors were drawn from communities where alcohol remained part of daily life. Judges were aware that harsh sentences would be unpopular. Fines were frequently minimal and absorbed as business expenses. That is not open rebellion, it is a passive resistance, and passive resistance multiplied across courts, juries, and police departments becomes powerful. There was no unified enforcement structure. Responsibility was divided among federal prohibition agents, city police, county sheriffs, magistrates, and local courts. Each answered to different incentives. Federal agents answered to Washington. City police answered to local political leadership. County officials had their own jurisdictions and alliances. Coordination was inconsistent. At times, it was openly adversarial. Federal agents would conduct raids only to see cases falter in local courtrooms. City officers might prioritize certain establishments while ignoring others. Political influence shaped outcomes long before verdicts were rendered. Fragmentation does not just slow enforcement, it creates gaps, and gaps create opportunity. Once operators understood how enforcement functioned, when raids were likely, which establishments were targeted, which officials were cooperative, they adapted. Selective enforcement rewards insulation. Insulation rewards organization. If survival depends on political protection and structured warning systems, independent operators face a choice. Operate alone and risk repeated disruption, or align with someone who can provide stability. That is the pivot. Bootlegging in Pittsburgh did not evolve into organized enterprise because of cinematic ambition. It evolved because instability made coordination valuable. Protection had a price. Stability had a premium, and someone had to manage it. By the time Pennington intensified enforcement, he was not confronting scattered lawbreakers. He was confronting a system that had already adapted. He increased raids, he increased seizures, he generated impressive statistics, but what he could not generate was alignment. Even as raids escalated, the system absorbed the pressure. Enforcement became visible, reportable, quantifiable, but not transformative. That distinction is critical. When enforcement lacks cultural consent and institutional unity, it does not eliminate the trade, it reorganizes it. By the mid to late 1920s, illegal alcohol in Pittsburgh was no longer an improvised rebellion. It was integrated, protection was structured, distribution routes were understood, political accommodation was normalized, risk was priced in, and when risk can be priced, it can be managed. Pennington's tenure demonstrates the national prohibition dilemma in microcosm. Energy without cohesion, effort without authority, action without structural change. The city remained wet, but something else had changed. Bootlegging was no longer merely tolerated, it was systematized. And wherever illegal markets became systematized, power consolidates. That is where the story now turns. A damning article published in the Pittsburgh Press in 1923, even before Pennington was on the scene, describes the level of disdain, hopelessness, and apathy the public had for the enforcement of prohibition at that time, both locally and nationally. Quote, 29 government agents have been murdered by bootleggers and rum runners. Thousands of moderate drinkers have been poisoned by deadly bootleg booze. Decent citizens who shudder at the thought of murder, who have never committed robbery or arson or bigamy, break the constitutional law of the United States without compunction. Defiance of the prohibition law is a national joke. The enforcement of prohibition is the biggest job in the United States today. It requires fearless, honest, efficient agents paid enough to keep them from the temptations of booze bribery. It needs, most of all, one big man as head of the National Enforcement Bureau in Washington. The man who now holds that job is honest, upright, hardworking, a longtime believer in prohibition. He is doing his best, but he is unknown. He lacks public confidence. He is not now the man for the job. Close quote. At the very moment Pittsburgh was becoming one of the wettest industrial cities in America, the man responsible for enforcing national prohibition was a Pittsburgher himself, Andrew William Mellon. Born in Pittsburgh in 1855, Mellon was not merely a wealthy banker, he was one of the most powerful men in the United States. By the 1920s, his family's financial empire had been deeply intertwined with Western Pennsylvania industry for decades: steel, aluminum, oil, railroads, banking. He was the embodiment of Pittsburgh's industrial elite. Physically, Mellon cut a distinctive figure. By the time Prohibition began, he was in his mid-60s, tall, lean, angular. His face was long and narrow, with sharp cheekbones and a thin, controlled mouth that rarely betrayed emotion. His hair, once dark, had faded to a pale silver gray combed neatly back from a high forehead, accented by a bushy white mustache that rested over his upper lip. In photographs, he appears reserved, almost austere, tailored suits, crisp collars, restrained posture. He did not radiate flamboyance, he radiated control. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed him Secretary of the Treasury. He would serve under Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover from 1921 until 1932, making him one of the longest-serving Treasury secretaries in American history. And here's where the story intersects directly with Pittsburgh. During Prohibition, enforcement of the Volstead Act fell under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department. That meant the Bureau of Prohibition, the federal agency tasked with enforcing the alcohol ban, operated under Mellon's authority. The federal government had placed prohibition inside the Treasury largely because alcohol taxation had historically been a revenue issue. The Internal Revenue Service had long regulated distillers and brewers for excise tax purposes. When alcohol was outlawed, enforcement mechanisms remained within the same bureaucratic structure. But Prohibition was not simply about revenue compliance. It was a national criminal enforcement experiment on an unprecedented scale, and it was faltering. By the early and mid-1920s, federal courts were flooded with alcohol-related cases. The Federal Judicial Center later documented that prohibition violations constituted the majority of federal criminal prosecutions during the decade. Nationally, the Bureau of Prohibition developed a reputation for corruption and uneven enforcement. Bribery, tip-offs, selective raids, these were not isolated scandals, but recurring themes in congressional hearings and investigative reporting. In response to mounting criticism, Mellon oversaw administrative reforms. In 1927, the Prohibition Bureau was separated more formally from the Internal Revenue Service in an attempt to professionalize the enforcement structure and reduce corruption. It was an effort at institutional repair, but restructuring the bureaucracy did not solve the deeper problem. The law required cultural compliance. Industrial cities did not provide it, and Pittsburgh was among the most resistant. The optics were unavoidable. The Secretary of the Treasury, the man overseeing national enforcement, was a native son of a city widely described as saturated with illegal alcohol. Critics did not need to accuse Mellon of personal misconduct to make their argument. They only had to point at the contradiction. Thousands of raids nationwide, tens of thousands of arrests, federal courts overwhelmed, and yet in Mellon's hometown, illegal bars flourished openly. Protection systems operated, ward politics negotiated enforcement. Still fires burned in the hills. Was that Mellon's direct fault? Not necessarily, but he presided over the system that failed to control it, and that distinction mattered politically. Congressional debates in the late 1920s increasingly criticized prohibition enforcement as inconsistent and corrupt. Industrial urban centers were repeatedly cited as examples of the law's uneven application. Western Pennsylvania was frequently mentioned in discussions about enforcement difficulties. Mellon's name inevitably hovered in the background. There is another layer to the narrative, one often repeated in Pittsburgh lore. Before Prohibition, the Mellon banking empire had financial exposure across numerous industries. In late 19th and early 20th century America, that industrial web included breweries and distilleries among many other enterprises. That is not unusual. Banking institutions of the era financed diversified portfolios, but during Prohibition, this historical connection fueled suspicion. Did Mellon personally own distilleries during Prohibition? No credible historical evidence supports that claim. Major biographical works, including David Carradine's Mellon and American Life, do not identify him as actively involved in alcohol production during the Prohibition era. Did his family's financial network intersect with alcohol-related enterprises before 1920? Yes. But indirect financial exposure in a diversified banking structure is not equivalent to operating illegal liquor operations. Still, the perception of proximity to alcohol wealth combined with Pittsburgh's wet reputation amplified criticism. Did Andrew Mellon drink? This is where the story moves from institutional contradiction into personal ambiguity. There is no credible historical evidence that Andrew Mellon publicly violated Prohibition law. No surviving letters, diaries, or investigative findings document him as running liquor operations or openly defying enforcement. Major biographical works, including the one we just cited, David Carradine's Mellon and American Life, do not portray him as a crusading dry, nor as a flamboyant wet. They describe him as reserved, disciplined, private, and deeply focused on financial and administrative matters. But here's what we do know. Prohibition did not eliminate drinking among America's elite. In many cities, Pittsburgh included, upper-class households, private clubs, and business circles continued to serve alcohol. Some had legal pre-1920 stocks, some obtained medical prescriptions, others simply relied on access connections and insulation from scrutiny. Elite drinking did not always occur in whispers. It occurred within protected environments. Working-class neighborhoods experienced raids, visible enforcement, and headline arrests. Wealthier circles often operated in socially insulated spaces with far less public disruption. Sounds like the political climate of today. Does that mean Mellon personally drank? We do not have documentary proof that he abstained, but we also don't have documentary proof that he was a habitual drinker. What we can say responsibly is this. He was not a nationally prominent temperance crusader. He did not publicly campaign for moral prohibition enforcement. He approached governance primarily through economic and administrative lenses, not moral activism. He lived within elite social circles where alcohol remained present despite the law. The ambiguity itself becomes part of the larger contradiction. The Secretary of the Treasury oversaw prohibition enforcement nationally. His hometown remained saturated. His social class retained access. And the enforcement system under his authority struggled with corruption and uneven application. That is not a proven story of personal hypocrisy. It is a story of institutional inconsistency. By the mid to late 1920s, Pittsburgh was not debating prohibition any longer. It was living around it. Federal agents conducted raids, courts processed cases, reports tallied enforcement activity. On paper, the system moved. On the streets, liquor flowed. The gap between law and reality was no longer a temporary lag in enforcement, it was structural. Arrests did not disrupt supply, seizures did not dismantle networks, court backlogs did not deter operators, political friction did not produce reform. Instead, the underground economy absorbed pressure and recalibrated. Police units, city officers, county deputies, and federal agents often operated under separate authorities with often competing priorities. Ward leaders influenced which neighborhoods felt pressure and which did not. Judges dismissed weak cases. Jurors resisted convicting neighbors for drinking. Officers, poorly paid and culturally unconvinced, had little incentive to treat liquor enforcement as a moral crusade. In fact, many of them drank themselves. Prohibition did not collapse from absence of effort. It stalled because enforcement never aligned with culture, politics, or economics. And when enforcement fragments, markets consolidate. The first years of Prohibition in Pittsburgh were chaotic. Scattered stills, improvised saloons, small-time operators testing risk. Chaos did not last. The profits were too large. Illegal alcohol was not a boutique vice. It was the largest black market commodity in the country. Nationally, Americans were spending hundreds of millions of dollars annually on illicit liquor. In industrial cities like Pittsburgh, demand was relentless. Steelworkers did not stop drinking because Congress passed a constitutional amendment. The money required management. Rural distillers in western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and eastern Ohio supplied urban distributors. Transport networks matured, warehouses became staging hubs, speakeasies developed tiered pricing and reliable supply schedules, protection payments standardized, disputes over territory became far more consequential. Bootlegging shifted from opportunism to enterprise. The men who thrived were not merely violent, they were organized. They coordinated suppliers, transporters, and retailers. They negotiated with political intermediaries. They budgeted for bribes. They managed risk. Before 1920, many criminal groups in Pittsburgh operated in narrow lanes: blackhand extortion, gambling rooms, labor intimidation. Prohibition widened the lane into a highway. It required capital, it required hierarchy, it required enforcement of agreements, it required control of predefined territories. And wherever control becomes valuable, consolidation follows. So by the mid-1920s, bootlegging in Pittsburgh was no longer a scattered collection of independent violators. It was coalescing into power blocks. Violence did not erupt because men were reckless. It erupted because markets were being divided. Prohibition did not invent organized crime in Pittsburgh. It accelerated it. It professionalized it. It capitalized it. And it created a generation of operators who learned to manage complex businesses, multi-state supply chains, protection systems, and cash-heavy enterprises before they were even 30 years old in many cases. The old political and economic orders still existed: industrial magnates, banking elites, party machines, but it was no longer operating alone. Prohibition did not drive the city, it reorganized it, and that reorganization produced something far more durable than a speakeasy. It produced infrastructure. A new class of power was rising alongside it. People that would become known invariably as Bootleg Kings or King of the Bootleggers in cities across the country, including here in Pittsburgh. Multi-state, large-scale operators who became millionaires almost overnight. But before we talk about the era of Bootleg Kings and who may have filled the vacuum after the death of Gregorio Conti, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. September 1919, Gregorio Conti is dead. The shots on Smallman Street have echoed. The funeral has passed. The Pittsburgh Wine and Liquor Company had already been dissolved, and as the city stands on the brink of national prohibition, something bigger than a single murder is unfolding. There is no clear successor. For years, Conti had served as a stabilizing force, consolidating Sicilian mafia elements and Camorra factions into a workable structure. He mediated disputes, he coordinated business, he kept fragmentation in check. Now that structure is gone. January 1920 is only months away. The question is simple: who's next? Before we move forward with our story, we need to pause briefly. We need to clarify where the previously mentioned players in previous episodes actually stood in late 1919. Several names have surfaced in earlier episodes as influential figures. That does not automatically make them successors. So we're going to quickly assess each one of them in this moment, not where they end up, not what they became, but where they stood when Conti fell. Because Prohibition is about to change everything, and whoever fills this vacuum will do so in a very different environment than the one Conti ruled. Some people point to Giuseppe Peppino Cusimano, who was a focus for part of episode number 47, Conti's nephew, his business associate, a chemist by training who helped operate the Pittsburgh wine and liquor enterprise. A recognized man of honor. On paper, he checks boxes: blood connection, business continuity, familiarity with the wholesale liquor trade, just as bootlegging is about to become exponentially more profitable. After Conti's murder, Cusimano even stepped forward publicly to defend his uncle's reputation. That suggests at least some measure of responsibility, perhaps even expectation. But temperament matters. Nicola Gentile, writing years later, described Cusimano as, quote, a capable boy who devoted much time to the business which he conducted in a very good fashion, although he was a bit stingy and not very outgoing with the customers, close quote. Capable, diligent, careful. Not exactly a portrait of a consolidator in a city about to fracture. And here's where the record becomes frustratingly thin. After Conti's murder in September 1919, we know that Peppino stepped forward publicly to defend his uncle's reputation. That much is documented. It suggests he felt some obligation, family, reputational, perhaps even organizational. But after that, he becomes a ghost. There is no clear documentation of him formally assuming leadership. No sustained reporting tying him to a reorganized structure as Prohibition intensifies. I don't care what Wikipedia says. No arrest records placing him at the center of major enforcement actions. No clear mention of him commanding territory or mediating disputes in the way Conti had. Even Nicola Gentile, who does not hesitate to discuss personalities and internal dynamics elsewhere in his book, offers no substantial follow-up about what became of Cusimano after 1919. That silence is telling, and so we're left with absence. Did he quietly step back from the emerging bootleg wars? Did he lack the temperament to hold together competing factions as profits and pressure increased? Did he leave Pittsburgh altogether, perhaps returning to Sicily? We don't know. There is no firm record confirming his departure, no death notice that clearly ties him to the immediate aftermath, no documented rise within the bootlegging hierarchy of the early 1920s. All we can say with confidence is this: after 1919, Giuseppe Peppino Cusimano fades from the historical foreground just as Prohibition is about to reshape the underworld. If he held influence, it was quiet and likely short-lived. Others point to Nicola Gentile, the seasoned Sicilian mediator with deep ties to Pittsburgh, as the man who might have stepped in after Conti's death. On paper, that makes a lot of sense. Respected, connected across cities, and already operating at a level beyond any one neighborhood. But the timeline complicates that theory. When Gregorio Conti was murdered in September 1919, Gentile may still have been incarcerated. As we discussed in episode number 47, on September 5th, 1918, he was sentenced to 18 months in the workhouse. Unless he secured early release, and there are indications he may have filed an appeal, he would not have been due to be released until sometime in 2020. So was he physically present in Pittsburgh when the vacuum opened? Possibly. But even if he had been released early, there is no clear evidence that he stepped forward to assume command of Conti's Borgata. There's no record of him consolidating power in the immediate aftermath, no contemporary indication that he publicly or quietly declared authority. In other words, whether by imprisonment or circumstance, we'll discuss that in a second, the man who may have had the stature to take control does not appear to have actually done so. He could have, doesn't look like he did. And that makes what he says next even more interesting, because according to Gentile himself, he had already predicted exactly what Prohibition would do to the liquor trade. Writing in his memoir, he recalled, quote, "In 1919, the law approved Prohibition, a law which prohibited the use and sale of alcoholic beverages. It was enacted on January 1st, 1920. Before the law was put in effect, I predicted that a bottle of whiskey would bring in a large sum of money. I implored all my friends in Pittsburgh and the surrounding communities to store the whiskey where they stored their fruit, and that I would pay them 75 cents a bottle. I established an agreement with Peppino Leonardo, Joseph Leonardo. Note, Peppino is a variation of the Italian name Giuseppe Joseph of Cleveland, Ohio, to arrange for the storage on large farms some loads of whiskey that I had ordered. Since Peppino Leonardo was the capo head of the mafia in Cleveland, no farmer would refuse to grant him that favor. As soon as the Prohibition law was enforced to a greater extent, I found out that I had hit the mark, because the law of supply and demand, as in similar circumstances, went into effect, i.e., when the supply decreased, the demand increased. The price of a bottle soared to $10. According to my figures, from the amount of bottles I had in storage, I estimated their value as being in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. After finishing my work, when I should have enjoyed myself at my greatest moment, I was stricken with an illness and collapsed. This occurred in 1919. Dr. Gaetano Conti was called, who gave me an injection and summoned an ambulance. I was taken to the hospital where my illness was diagnosed. I had a nervous condition and absolute rest was prescribed." Close quote. So by Gentile's own telling, he was poised to capitalize massively on Prohibition, and it seems that he was out before 1920, yet the illness removed him from the scene at that critical moment. He would continue, quote, "Umberto Valenti, residing in New York, a man of great courage, intelligence, and a good friend of mine, upon learning that I was taken to the hospital, had the impression that I was wounded and came to visit me. Finally realizing that his suspicion was not correct, he became content. He was afraid, however, that someone would take advantage by my illness and try to surprise me. Therefore, he took me to his home to recuperate, and after about a month my health improved somewhat, so I decided to leave for Italy, where, with rest and tranquility, I would have my long convalescence. In 1919, during an election at Real Monte, Sicily, a man named Francesco Lapaglia, an Italo-American, was shot by a bullet. Before he died, he was asked who was his assassin, and he named me. The police inspector of the Carabinieri police that night took me to his headquarters. When questioned, I told him I did not even know Lapaglia, and therefore had no reason to kill him." Close quote. Gentile was detained in Sicily, charged, and eventually cleared. After 6 months, he returned to the United States, but not to Pittsburgh. Quote, "6 months later, cleared of my charge, I departed for the United States. But rather than select New York as my place of arrival, I took a steamship that had Boston as its port of call." Close quote. From there, Gentile moved restlessly Boston, Cleveland, and other cities, embedding himself in new networks and new disputes. In Cleveland, his conflict with mafia boss Joseph Leonardo escalated to the point that a contract was reportedly placed on his life. Gentile was anything but retired. He remained active, connected, and deeply involved in the evolving national underworld, but he was not in Pittsburgh. That absence isn't just a narrative convenience, it's traceable. His name largely disappears from Pittsburgh newspaper coverage through much of the 1920s. Whatever influence he retained in Western Pennsylvania, it was indirect at best. So as 1919 turned into 1920, as the Volstead Act loomed and Prohibition prepared to explode the liquor trade into something far larger than Conti had ever overseen, the most seasoned and internationally connected Sicilian figure with ties to Pittsburgh was operating somewhere else. The chair at the head of the table in Pittsburgh remained unclaimed, and when a vacuum like that opens, especially in a city about to become one of the wettest in America, someone inevitably steps forward. Some historians point next to a different name. Before we get to that chapter, before the gunfire, the betrayals, and the rise of Stefano Monastero, we need to close this one properly. Salvatore Calderone. There's something almost mythic about Calderone in Western Pennsylvania lore, the banana magnate from Apollo, the quiet Sicilian elder whose name surfaces in fragments, rarely in headlines, never in indictments, but often in connection with influence. To some, he was the invisible hand presiding over Western Pennsylvania's Sicilian underworld. To others, he's little more than a shadow, a rumor passed between generations. The truth, more than likely, sits somewhere in between. Calderone was born in 1858 in Termini Imerese, Sicily, a coastal town east of Palermo, to Saverio Calderone and Maria Gatta. He married a woman named Anna Mantia in 1891 at age 33 and immigrated to the United States in April 1898 aboard the SS Aller, arriving through Ellis Island by way of Naples. After time in Pittsburgh, he relocated around 1901 to Apollo, Pennsylvania, a quiet borough roughly 35 miles northeast of the city. Family members, including brothers Agostino and Antonino, settled nearby in Salzburg. In Apollo, Calderone established himself as a wholesale produce merchant and wine distributor, perfectly legitimate businesses on paper, and precisely the kind of enterprises that often anchored early mafia influence in the immigrant communities. By 1902, newspaper records show him active in the wholesale produce trade, including operations tied to Indiana, Pennsylvania, the future site of one of his bottling plants. The family would later operate the Apollo Bottling Works with facilities in Apollo, Indiana, and Blairsville, enterprises that functioned as genuine businesses and very likely convenient fronts for illicit liquor distribution as Prohibition approached. Our clearest connective tissue between Calderone and the region's underworld comes from the memoir of Nicola Gentile, scattered FBI references, and periodic newspaper mentions. Gentile refers to Calderone as his capo, a title that suggests formal authority within a broader territorial structure. That does not necessarily mean boss in the later post-1931 sense, although capo was typically translated into boss. It may have reflected an older Sicilian model, a sectional leader, mediator, and senior authority whose power derived from age, standing, and reputation. Calderone's name appears as S. Calderone among attendees at the 1914 Hotel Battaglia banquet honoring Salvatore Catanzaro, an evening that, in hindsight, reads like a gathering of Western Pennsylvania's Sicilian elite, the who's who of the mafia at the time. His listing carried no special flourish, and that may have been the point. He wasn't loud, he wasn't theatrical, he appears to have preferred influence without exposure. Some historians go further and argue that Calderone, not Conti, played a key role in mediating and unifying Pittsburgh's fractured Italian underworld, bridging tensions between Sicilian mafia and Neapolitan Camorra elements. If true, that would place him less as a street boss and more as a regional stabilizer, an elder statesman of sorts. But here's the problem. Documentation is thin. There are no arrest records tying him directly to organized crime, no mugshots, no sensational trials, very little in the way of paper evidence that would allow a modern historian to draw a straight line between Calderone and criminal command. And as Prohibition transformed liquor from steady profit into industrial-scale opportunity and then into violence, Calderone's path appears to diverge from the younger generation. If he entered the bootlegging trade aggressively, there is little hard evidence of it. Given his age, already in his 60s as Prohibition intensified, and the bloodshed that would soon follow, it is entirely plausible that he chose restraint over escalation. By around 1925, it is said that he stepped back from underworld life, not driven out in a hail of gunfire, but pressured by changing tides. He probably saw the writing on the wall. The new men wanted territory, enforcement, spectacle. The old world codes were eroding. Calderone seems to have understood what that shift meant. The Apollo Bottling Works would make headlines later, a 1927 truck accident involving a relative that killed one man and injured four others, and a 1929 gas explosion that destroyed the Blairsville facility, causing significant damage. But those events attached to the company, not to Calderone personally. He himself left almost no public trail of scandal. Salvatore Calderone died quietly on April 16, 1933, at 75 years old after a prolonged illness, just as Prohibition was collapsing under its own weight. For a man rumored to have ruled western Pennsylvania's Sicilian underworld, it was an unusually peaceful exit. And with Calderone's chapter closed, the elder, the mediator, the possible regional capo, the stage clears. And then Prohibition hits, not gradually, not politely. It lands like a shockwave in 1920. Across the country, almost overnight, the underworld reorganizes. In city after city, new alliances form, old rivalries resurface, new rivalries crop up, groups begin jockeying for territory, supply lines, political protection, and something far more durable than street reputation, generational wealth. Pittsburgh is no exception. Whatever fragile consolidation Conti and Gentile had helped impose begins to loosen. The liquor trade is no longer a niche wholesale operation tucked behind produce fronts and import businesses. It becomes industrial. It becomes decentralized, and it becomes competitive. It becomes multi-ethnic. Italian factions regroup. Jewish syndicates expand. Irish gangs lean into distribution. Eastern European and Slovak outfits carve out neighborhoods. Independent operators crop up everywhere, from riverfront warehouses to row house basements. Fragmentation ensues. What was consolidated before is now fragmented again, by neighborhood, by ethnicity. Bootlegging doesn't replace the old street gangs, it evolves them. Everybody wants in, and enforcement, as we said, can't keep the pace. With thousands of small stills scattered across basements, sheds, boarding houses, hills, rural farms, shutting down bootlegging becomes like trying to empty the Monongahela with a bucket. You might slow it in one spot, but it's flowing somewhere else. And in that chaos, reputations are made very quickly. And some of the first men to emerge in Pittsburgh as true, quote, bootleg kings aren't even Italian at all. That mirrors what we see in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, where early Prohibition profits often go to whoever moves the most quickly, the first movers, the fastest, and not necessarily to whoever holds the oldest mafia credentials. In Pittsburgh, the initial scramble for control isn't about tradition, it's about supply, distribution, and protection. And the power belongs to the groups who seize that opportunity first, as I just said. There were plenty of characters in the underworld in those days, and many that were crowned the Bootleg King or the King of the Bootleggers, not just in Pittsburgh, but around the entire country. Often this was just fluff and fodder for local newspapers to make someone look more significant than they actually were. However, there are a few times where this description legitimately fit, as was the case with someone like George Remus in Cincinnati. Today, we're going to talk about a few that stood out locally in the Pittsburgh area during the early days. These were Jack Branch and Martin Burke. The rest of the episode will center on these guys, less with Branch, but more with Burke. An incredible story. On April 29, 1922, federal prohibition agents arrested two Pittsburgh druggists, brothers Joseph and Samuel Engelsberg, along with a New Yorker named Jack Branch. Authorities alleged the three were operating a nationwide whiskey diversion scheme, stealing bonded liquor from warehouses and redirecting it into the illicit market. At the time, Pittsburgh's prohibition director, John Exnicios, declared Branch, quote, the biggest bootlegger in the United States, close quote. That was almost certainly an exaggeration. Branch was clever, sophisticated enough to orchestrate a multi-state operation, but there is little evidence he was anywhere near the top tier of national bootlegging power. The claim reads more like a press-friendly headline than a measured assessment. Branch appears to have been the architect of the operation. He forged federal permits authorizing the removal of liquor from bonded facilities in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. The permits were carefully structured. Shipments were always capped at 14 cases because 15 or more triggered additional government verification. It was a small detail and a smart one designed to keep the paperwork moving without raising suspicion. In Pittsburgh, his local partners were the Engelsberg brothers, owners of the Paul drugstore at Center Avenue and Miller Street. According to the Pittsburgh Post, Joseph Engelsberg was, quote, one of the best-known politicians in the Hill District, close quote, active in mayoral and state campaigns. The political visibility likely provided insulation or, at a minimum, access. The scheme eventually unraveled. During the investigation, authorities discovered that Branch had kept a list of bootleg contacts from across the country in his possession, a dangerous habit in an era where discretion was currency. More than a year later, on November 30th, 1923, the jury in the case against Branch and the Engelsbergs was discharged after 19 hours of deliberation without reaching a verdict. A mistrial was declared. What happens to the case after that is unclear. Records grow thin. But what is clear is this. Whatever Branch was, he was not the singular, quote, biggest bootlegger in the United States. Hell, he wasn't even the biggest bootlegger in Pittsburgh. He was part of an early Prohibition scramble. Ambitious, organized, politically connected, but still operating in a marketplace that was only beginning to consolidate. This is one example where the enforcement arm tried to make itself look like it had done something more important than it actually had. But in the case of Pittsburgh's next bootleg king, there would actually be some substance to their claims. Martin M. Burke was born on December 21, 1871, in Pennsylvania to Irish immigrant parents Matthias and Mary J. Burke. Though Pennsylvania-born, the Burke family's path to Pittsburgh reportedly ran through Kentucky before they ultimately settled in the Steel City. He grew up in a working-class immigrant household shaped by hustle and opportunity, qualities he would later embody. Martin was not alone in his ambitions. He had two brothers, Thomas Burke Jr. and James Burke, and together they would become fixtures in Pittsburgh's Hill District long before Prohibition turned them into household names. By the late 1890s, both brothers were already established in Pittsburgh's saloon trade. Martin operated a well-known North Side saloon, while Thomas ran one several blocks up Wiley Avenue near Roberts Street. Around 1902, they consolidated their interests at what would become their power base, the intersection of Wiley Avenue and Fullerton Street in the Lower Hill District. This was no accidental move. The Hill was rapidly becoming one of Pittsburgh's most dynamic neighborhoods, dense, diverse, politically active, and economically vibrant. This crosses over, of course, with Gregorio Conti from our second episode. He was big time in the Hill District as well. Now, the Burkes reorganized that energy early. Through a series of real estate purchases and saloon license applications, they transformed Wiley and Fullerton into a magnet for nightlife. Their cornerstone holdings included 1501 through 1505 Wiley Avenue and the Fulton Hotel at 57 Fullerton Street. Over time, they expanded their footprint with additional Wiley Avenue saloons and in 1914, constructed what would become one of the area's most notable entertainment complexes, the building at 53 to 55 Fullerton Street, later known as Burke's Theater or Burke's Hall. That 1914 structure was substantial for its time, a two-story entertainment and retail complex built at a cost of $7,500, a significant investment in the Lower Hill. The nearly 8,000 square foot building housed a dance hall, a jukebox theater, and a commercial space, anchoring the intersection as a center of nightlife. The Burkes were not simply operating saloons, they were engineering an entertainment corridor. Through real estate acquisitions and steady saloon licensing, they helped transform Wiley and Fullerton into one of the busiest social crossroads in the Hill. the magnet for drink, music, politics, and increasingly, vice. Martin was not a shadowy back alley operator. He was a public businessman whose name appeared on property records and in city directories. Over the years, he listed his occupations as real estate broker and hotel proprietor. He owned a restaurant, saloon, and hotel, but no matter the title, he was invariably described as what he truly was, a saloon keeper. And I think you can just classify him as more even an entrepreneur. In early 20th century Pittsburgh, that occupation meant more connections than you'd think, and often facilitated access and reach. Saloons functioned as informal political headquarters and neighborhood clearinghouses. Ward leaders gathered there, voters were mobilized there, police officers stopped in, deals were discussed, patronage flowed. A successful saloon keeper was rarely just a simple bartender. He was plugged into the ward system, the party machine, and the rhythms of the neighborhood. As the Mansfield News Journal later wrote, quote, "Starting as a young ward politician, Martin Burke opened a saloon which he ran for 30 years, close quote. That phrase, young ward politician, matters. Burke didn't stumble into influence during Prohibition. He had been cultivating it for decades. The Burke brothers' influence, however, was not universally admired. The Pittsburgh Courier published a blistering assessment of their legacy, writing, quote, "For 20 years or more, the brothers, Martin and Tommy, have been traffickers in liquor and keepers of saloons," close quote, and concluding bluntly that, quote, "the race is better off," close quote, without them. The column penned by John Clark criticized the Burkes for profiting heavily from black patrons in the Hill District while refusing to hire black bartenders in their establishments. The message was clear. The Burkes were powerful, visible, and deeply embedded in the neighborhood's economy, but they were also somewhat controversial. Their success depended on the Hill's social energy, even as they operated within and benefited from its racial and political tensions. By the time national prohibition took effect in January 1920, the Burkes were no amateurs stepping into opportunity. They had spent nearly 3 decades building their infrastructure, real estate holdings, multiple saloons, a hotel, entertainment venues, political connections, a steady customer base, and access to liquor distribution networks. On paper, they were successful businessmen. In practice, they were perfectly positioned to pivot. When alcohol went underground, the Burkes did not need to invent a network. They already had one. Their saloons could quietly convert into speakeasies. Their hotel and other properties could house storage. Their entertainment venues continued to draw crowds. Their political relationships could cushion enforcement pressure. Their customer base did not disappear simply because Congress passed an amendment. Martin understood the system, and more importantly, he understood how to navigate it. Liquor did not sustain him financially. It made him extraordinarily wealthy. In the early years of Prohibition, he used legitimate enterprises as fronts and distribution hubs, diverting medicinal liquor and tapping into broader supply networks that extended beyond Pittsburgh, reaching into cities like Cleveland and Chicago. He was not a basement moonshiner tinkering with a still in a cellar. He was a big-time operator. And in a city dotted with thousands of small stills and illicit bars, Burke stood out because of scale and organization. He had the capital to buy in bulk, he had properties to shield operations, he had ward connections to buffer raids, and he had decades of experience managing business, politics, and vice simultaneously. And as the Lower Hill District increasingly became known as the nightlife crossroads, what some would later describe as the, quote, crossroads of the world during Prohibition, the groundwork laid by the Burke brothers before 1920 positioned Martin specifically to capitalize on the boom. The wealth he accumulated during Prohibition was not improvised. It was constructed years earlier at Wiley and Fullerton, brick by brick, license by license, favor by favor. Before he was labeled a Prohibition-era bootleg king, Martin Burke was a ward politician, saloon keeper, real estate operator, and nightlife impresario who helped transform one intersection in the Hill District into a hub of alcohol, entertainment, and political leverage. By the early 1920s, he was not merely participating in Pittsburgh's liquor economy, he was positioned to dominate it. He had built the stage. Prohibition simply raised the curtain. Even before Prohibition was fully underway, the Burke family was making headlines for an alleged involvement in serious criminal enterprise. In May of 1920, Martin and his brothers Thomas and James were arrested in connection with the theft of $86,215 from the Adams Express Company, a staggering sum at the time. The Pittsburgh Press broke the story of the Burke brothers' arrests, making clear that they were not obscure figures. Quote, "Charge rich man conceals stolen express funds. What may clear up the mystery of what happened to $86,215, which was stolen from the Adams Express Company by Louis Beck, who is now serving a term in the Western Penitentiary, was an action started in Common Pleas Court when a bench warrant was issued for the arrest of Martin M. Burke, Thomas Burke, and James Burke by Judge Cohen. In an affidavit made by William M. Barrett, president of the Adams Express Company, which was presented to the court, it is alleged that Beck turned over the money he stole from the company while he was in their employ to the three persons mentioned, and that they have and are fraudulently concealing it." Close quote. The allegation was direct, that the stolen funds had been handed to the Burke brothers and were being concealed. Frank McGurr, attorney for the Express Company, would say of Martin Burke, quote, "He will not have any difficulty in securing bail. I understand that he is a wealthy man now. He made a lot of money out of this money, which was stolen from the Express Company and which was turned over to him." Close quote. Burke's attorney immediately pushed back, quote, "The money was never turned over to him. He is a freeholder in this country and he can secure bail. It all depends upon the character of the security they will require. He has real estate worth $300,000 and he also has personal property. If counsel will accept his own bail, we can arrange for that." Close quote. The numbers are revealing. The stolen $86,215 alone represents roughly $1.85 million in modern purchasing power. And when Burke's own attorney referenced $300,000 in real estate holdings, that translates to roughly $4.8 million today. Burke personally admitted to $350,000 in real estate holdings, so go ahead and increase the modern day total. That's well over $5 million. Even stripped of the allegation, one fact was undeniable. Martin Burke entered Prohibition already capitalized. Whether or not the Express Company's claims were ever substantiated, the case ultimately produced no lasting consequence for the Burke brothers. No major conviction, no prison term that halted their rise. The episode faded, as many such cases did during the chaotic early Prohibition years, but the headlines accomplished something else. They established that the Burkes were wealthy, liquid, connected, comfortable navigating high-stakes legal trouble, and publicly associated with large sums of cash. If, and it remains an allegation, the brothers had access to even a portion of that stolen money, it would have represented precisely the kind of working capital required to scale quickly in the new underground economy. Liquor during Prohibition was not a small-time trade. It required upfront cash for inventory, transportation, storage, protection, and political insulation. You could take a score like that and reinvest it. It would go a long way. And for the next 2 years, from 1920 through 1922, the Burke operation appeared to expand rather than contract. Wiley and Fullerton remained active. The lower hill pulsed at night. Medicinal liquor loopholes were exploited. Diversion schemes multiplied. Enforcement remained inconsistent. Money flowed. But serious bootlegging in the early 1920s was rarely confined to a single city. Pittsburgh sat at a strategic crossroads, rail lines, river traffic, and highways connecting it to Cleveland, Chicago, and the broader Midwest. Operators who intended to grow beyond neighborhood scale needed partnerships beyond city limits. There is clear evidence that Burke's distribution interests intersected with Cleveland and Chicago, two cities that were rapidly becoming Prohibition power centers in their own right. Cleveland, with its proximity to Canadian supply routes across Lake Erie, became a major intake point for liquor entering the Midwest. Chicago, already evolving into a bootlegging empire under competing factions, required steady inflows and regional redistribution networks. Pittsburgh fit naturally into that chain, whether through direct partnerships, negotiated supply agreements, or coordinated diversion schemes. Men like Burke would not have operated in isolation. The economics of Prohibition demanded inter-city relationships. Bulk shipments required scale. Scale required trust, or at least mutually beneficial arrangements. And once you begin doing business across city lines, the stakes rise. Territories matter more. Reputation matters more. Reliability matters more. And disputes travel. For a time, Burke appeared to be leveraging those conditions effectively. He was not fighting to survive Prohibition, he was using it. And the system rewarded operators who already possessed what he had: property, political relationships, an established nightlife district, and access to capital. But rapid expansion in an illegal interstate market brings visibility. And visibility invites both competition and scrutiny. By 1922, Burke's expansion had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just profiting from Prohibition's chaos. He was measurable, traceable, indictable. And for a decade in which Prohibition agents were often dismissed as paper tigers, raiding basements, smashing stills, chasing small operators, this one was different. They had not stumbled onto a neighborhood still. They had mapped an interstate wholesale network. For all the criticism leveled at enforcement, especially earlier on this episode, federal agents had finally hooked a man whose operation matched the rhetoric. Thousands of cases, contracts, brokers, drug fronts, paper trails, the seeds of Burke's ultimate downfall were being planted, not by rival gunmen, not yet, but by paper, indictments, case numbers, federal grand juries. For the first time, the Burke machine was exposed in writing. And once a network is documented, it becomes vulnerable. That vulnerability became public on January 4th, 1922, when Martin Burke was arrested along with 4 other men on charges of conspiracy and violation of the National Prohibition Act. This was not a neighborhood raid. It was federal, interstate, coordinated. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported, quote, "Pittsburgh man gives $5,000 bail in whiskey case. One of 4 indicted in Ohio for violating dry law arrested here. Martin Burke, 200 South Fairmont Avenue, was arrested yesterday on charges of conspiracy in violation of the National Prohibition Act. He gave $5,000 bail for a hearing before the United States Commissioner. The arrest was made after Special Assistant United States Attorney George V. Moore received a certified copy of an indictment against Burke, Harry S. Lynn, George Martino, and Claude R. Madleen, returned by a federal grand jury at Cleveland. A complaint against Burke was made by C.C. Gregg, Prohibition agent. The indictment charges that Burke and 3 others continually from last July 1st to October 1st possessed intoxicating liquor, which was intended for illegal use. It is alleged the defendants purchased 1,980 cases of whiskey, which had been tax-paid for medicinal purposes only. The defendants, it is alleged in the indictment, engaged in the wholesale drug business under the name of the Lynn Company at Akron, Ohio. It is also alleged that Burke, on October 9th, entered into a contract with William Lucking, a whiskey broker of Cincinnati, for the purchase of 5,000 cases of whiskey for the Lynn Company." Close quote. This was not small-time bootlegging. Nearly 2,000 cases already purchased, a contract for 5,000 more. A wholesale drug front in Akron, a Cincinnati broker, a Cleveland grand jury. What had once just been a rumor was now recorded. Burke's operation was no longer shielded by ward politics and nightlife density. It was entered into federal proceedings, documented, itemized, and attached to co-defendants across state lines. And once charges begin to circulate, pressure follows. Burke and his Ohio-based compatriots fought the case. They filed appeals. They challenged procedure. They attempted to slow the machinery of federal prosecution, but for whatever reason, this case held. He was extradited to Ohio and released on a $10,000 bond, a sizable sum, but manageable for a man of his means. Then came the turn. On January 9th, 1923, Burke was indicted in Cleveland, and this time, the fight ended not with another delay, but with a guilty plea. The Pittsburgh Post reported, quote, "Pittsburgher sent to prison and fined $2,000 on dry charge." Cleveland, January 8th, Associated Press. Martin Burke of Pittsburgh, an alleged mastermind in a whiskey deal said to have involved more than $250,000, changed his plea from not guilty to guilty of conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act in federal court here today and was fined $2,000 and sentenced to 13 months in the federal penitentiary at Atlanta, Georgia, by Judge Killitz. Burke was indicted with officers of the Lynn Company, a wholesale drug firm of Akron, Ohio, alleged to have perverted the use of prescriptions. Close quote. 13 months, a $2,000 fine. Now let's separate those two penalties. The fine was nothing. For a man whose attorney had publicly cited $300,000 in real estate holdings and who had been accused of involvement in transactions involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in whiskey, a $2,000 fine was absorbable. It was a business expense, a rounding error, the cost of operating at scale in an illegal market. But the prison sentence was different. 13 months in the federal penitentiary at Atlanta meant absence. It meant loss of day-to-day control. It meant vulnerability. In Prohibition's underground economy, leadership was not theoretical. It often required presence. Deals had to be negotiated, shipments coordinated, protection maintained, and rivals managed. You can pay a fine. However, delegating authority in this climate rarely comes without consequence. Absence in a city already crowded with ambitious operators creates opportunity for others. And here's the part that stands out. This was Prohibition-era Pittsburgh, a city where cases often dissolved, where charges stalled, where fines were light, where influence and money frequently softened the outcomes. Burke had capital, he had property, he had the political connections, he had operated for years at the intersection of vice and ward power. Yet in this instance, he did not make the problem disappear, and you have to ask why. Was it simply that the scale and interstate nature of the case placed it beyond the reach of local accommodation? Federal jurisdiction meant federal consequences. A Cleveland grand jury was not a ward magistrate. A federal penitentiary was not a negotiated fine. The $2,000 penalty was symbolic. The 13 months were not. Or was there something else at play? A calculation, an arrangement, a decision made behind closed doors that never made it into the record? Because what happened next suggests that more was moving beneath the surface than appeared in the court transcript. Prison creates absence. Absence creates opportunity. And in early 1923, opportunity in Pittsburgh's liquor trade was worth killing for. Before we go any further, I should note that some of the contemporary reporting we're about to reference contains language reflective of its era. We will, though, present it as it's written for the sake of historical accuracy. Now we turn to the day everything changed. Before we conclude our story, let's pause one last time for a word from our sponsors. January 14th, 1923, 6 days after the guilty plea. One day before he is scheduled to report to the United States Marshals in Cleveland. Evening settles over 200 South Fairmont Avenue. Inside, Martin Burke is upstairs on the second floor speaking with his housekeeper, a Mrs. May Munns, in the sitting room. There is tension in the air, not panic, not fear, just the weight of what lies ahead. Still, the house feels orderly, familiar. This is a room where business has been discussed for years, where plans have been made and fortunes calculated. His chauffeur has just left to drive his brother Thomas home. Not a goodbye, but a hold strong, see you when you get out, that sort of thing. Prison looms, but tonight is about logistics, settling affairs, reviewing accounts, putting pieces in place. The expectation is not collapse, it is continuity. 13 months is an interruption, not an ending. There is every assumption that he will return, resume control, and begin earning again. The future, in this moment, still belongs to him, and he's planning for life after prison. Tomorrow, he begins serving 13 months in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The fine is $2,000. It's nothing, manageable. Prison time, well, that's something else. Then the doorbell rings. It's unexpected. Not alarming, not yet, but unexpected. At this hour, visitors tend to come by arrangement. Still, word has spread. He is leaving for prison in the morning. It wouldn't be unusual for someone to stop by, a political ally, a business associate, an old customer wanting to shake his hand before he goes off to do his bid. Burke exhales, fairly annoyed. There's work to finish, papers to review, affairs to settle. Time is short, and interruptions are unwelcome. But appearances matter. So he rises from his chair and heads downstairs. On the lower floor, the Jenna family is seated at a table with friends. They hear voices at the door, louder than ordinary conversation. Something sharp in the exchange. It lasts only seconds. 2 shots. Revolver fire, close, abrupt, final. Mrs. Munns rushes towards the stairs. The Jenna family moves toward the vestibule entrance. Burke is lying on the stairway, covered in blood. He cannot speak. A bullet has passed through his heart. Outside, an automobile accelerates at high speed down Fairmont towards Penn Avenue and out of sight. By dawn, the city is buzzing with the news. The man who was supposed to report to federal prison that morning is not boarding a train. Yesterday, he was a bootleg king. Today, he's in the morgue. For 3 years, bootlegging in Pittsburgh has been measured in arrests, fines, seizures, and rumors, political deals, quiet payoffs, courtroom maneuvering. Now, more and more, it is measured in blood. The Pittsburgh Post would make the news official. Quote, "Bootleg leader murdered, laid to feud with associates. Martin Burke is shot down in home by 2 gunmen. Pals feared he would peach, detectives believe. Killed on eve of prison term." Martin Burke, 52 years old, saloon keeper and politician who made $1 million in bootlegging whiskey, was shot dead on the steps of his home at 200 South Fairmont Avenue at 6:10 o'clock last night by 2 gunmen hired by Cleveland bootleggers who feared he would peach. The murderers had not been captured early this morning. Burke's death came on the eve of his beginning a 13-month sentence in the federal prison at Atlanta, Georgia, for conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act. He was convicted in Cleveland, but had been given time to settle his affairs. The murder, reconstructed from the meager evidence detectives obtained, was a deliberate and well-planned assassination. Burke was in his home on the 2nd floor. His chauffeur, Carol Thompson, a Negro, had just left the house to take Thomas Burke, brother of the dead man, to his home. In the house at the time was Mrs. May Munns of 3459 Ward Street, his housekeeper, whose husband was killed in October 1921 in Cleveland while running from an officer who caught him delivering whiskey to a garage. Burke and Mrs. Munns were talking. The doorbell rang. Burke went downstairs to open the door. The family of Henry Jenna, occupying the lower floor, were at a table with friends. Loud talking was heard. 2 shots fired. 2 revolver shots followed. Mrs. Munns rushed downstairs. Burke was lying on the stairway, covered in blood. He could not speak. A bullet had passed through his heart. The Jenna family rushed to the vestibule entrance. An automobile was seen speeding towards Penn Avenue. Police, detectives, and a physician were called. Burke was dead when a doctor arrived. Commissioner Deasy of the Frankstown Avenue Police Station and a squad plainclothesmen rushed to the scene of the murder. They were followed by Captain of Detectives Louis Leff and Lieutenant of Detectives Edward Brophy and a squad of city detectives. The information they obtained, they said, was scant. Orders were issued at once to watch all railway stations. Burke's body was hurried to the morgue and a post-mortem examination quickly made. The examination revealed the wounds in his body were made by 38 and 45 caliber revolvers. This established, detectives said, that there had been 2 gunmen. A bullet, believed to be one that passed through Burke's heart, lodged in the facing of the door of the downstairs apartment of the duplex house. It was a steel jacket bullet. Burke was shot in the back as if he had turned around after refusing his murderers something that they had demanded. Meanwhile, Burke's papers had been searched by detectives. What information they got from these was not revealed. Motorcycle policeman Florence Bruner reported seeing 2 autos bearing Ohio license plates speed past him as he stood in Bigelow Boulevard a short distance from the scene of the crime. This was a few minutes after the murder, it was established. Orders were then issued to instruct police of all outlying towns to watch for cars bearing Ohio licenses, the first numerals of which were 1132. Burke probably was killed by gunmen hired by Cleveland bootleggers, said a detective after the gathering of first evidence had been made. This, the detective said, seemed the most plausible of any theory deduced from the evidence. Burke recently was convicted at Cleveland with DJ Lynn, George Martino, and Louis Madeline, co-officers with Burke of the Lynn Drug Company, Akron, Ohio, in connection with the illegal withdrawal of 24,000 quarters of whiskey from a Rossville, Indiana distillery. Burke pleaded guilty, but fought extradition with all his political power for a year before being taken to Ohio for trial. The three named co-officers are serving 18-month sentences in Atlanta. Burke was to report to the United States Marshal at Cleveland tomorrow morning to begin serving his 13-month sentence. Burke was released on $10,000 bail to return to Pittsburgh to settle important affairs. It is alleged that in the courtroom at Cleveland after being sentenced, Burke declared he was going to tell all he knew of certain bootleg deals. Detectives said that following this, threats were made by Cleveland bootleggers to fix him. Career meteoric. Burke had a meteoric career. He was a ward politician, a saloon keeper for more than 30 years, and boasted of having made more than $1 million in the bootleg business. He owned a costly residence in Atlantic City, his home where he was killed, and is said to have been interested in a number of enterprises, the exact nature of which is not known. A few years ago, his wife, then separated from him, committed suicide. Martin M. Burke, his son, was involved in the theft of $86,215 from the Adams Express Company. Burke is alleged to have effected a settlement with the company and thus saved his son from prosecution. Detectives were said to be sent to Cleveland, it was said last night, to follow up clues there. Close quote. Now, I think that there's some confusion on the Martin M. Burke being his son. Based on my research, it was Martin Burke himself who had stolen the $86,215 from Express. But perhaps I'm wrong. But based on my research and some of the lineage, I don't think Burke actually had a son. I think that was him. But that's neither here nor there. Burke's dead. As detectives piece together the scene, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette begins to report what others only speculate, how it happened, who may have ordered it, and what Burke may have said before he died. Quote, yesterday afternoon, Burke, with 4 men and Mrs. May Munns, aged 25, his housekeeper, was discussing business matters in his home, the second floor of a duplex dwelling, when someone pressed the bell button at the first floor entrance. Burke, it is said, expressed displeasure at being interrupted, but went to the door. Instantly, the shots rang out. One of the men who had been with Burke is said to have run down to the door and to have heard a man shout, "I got you now!" Police believe the slayers had a Confederate who stayed at the wheel of an automobile parked at the curb, its motor running. Other persons in the neighborhood who heard the shooting and ran to their windows say they saw no one. Dies in few minutes. Mrs. Munns and Burke's other companions, C. Shaptler of 902 Blackador Avenue, James P. McFadden of 341 South Highland Avenue, J. Wilson of 7100 Penn Avenue, and Max Sugarman of 902 Blackador Avenue ran to the doorway. They carried Burke unconscious to the living room of his home. He was unable to talk, and death came within a few minutes before a physician arrived. A bullet that had passed through his heart wedged into the doorway of the home of Henry Jenna, who lives in the first floor of the duplex. Mr. Jenna heard the shot and reached the door soon after Burke's companions. From a telephone in the Jenna home, police were notified, and Dr. J.W. Worrell of 110 South Fairmont Avenue was summoned. Police Commissioner Jerry D. Deasy, with the squad of plainclothesmen, went to the South Fairmont Avenue house. Superintendent Calhoun, notified of the shooting, at once issued a general order to stop all automobiles bearing Ohio license numbers and to hold their occupants for questioning. Word of the shooting was broadcast throughout the city police districts to county detectives and to state police. A guard was placed on all automobile exits from the city, and city detectives were detailed to hotels and rooming houses to question all transients open to suspicion. Planned new restaurant. According to Mr. Shapter, Burke and his friends had been discussing a proposal to open a restaurant in East Liberty, and Burke was planning to finance the enterprise. He also had been going over his income tax liabilities, Shapter said. Burke was generally regarded as a wealthy man. He had conducted saloons and hotels in Pittsburgh and vicinity for a period of 30 years, and at one time had been identified with a widely known saloon in Fullerton Street near Wiley Avenue. Burke maintained a home at Atlantic City, it was said last night. He was said to have paid $50,000 for it a few years ago. Burke's only near relative is a brother, Thomas Burke, of 316 Negley Avenue. Thomas Burke and his chauffeur and Howard Vogel of Carrick had left Martin Burke's house only a short time before the shooting, the police learned, and they were summoned for questioning. They said they had seen no one likely to have been the slayers loitering in the vicinity. Threatened by bootleggers. Police Commissioner Deasy last night issued this statement. For some time, Martin Burke has had trouble with bootleggers in Cleveland. It is understood that he held evidence against them in that city and his life had been threatened because of it. It is known that his enemies told him he would never serve his time in Atlanta. Mrs. Munns is said to have made this statement to the police. When he opened the door, I heard one shot. I also heard someone say, "I've got you now." When they carried Mr. Burke upstairs, I asked him who did it all. He merely said, "Here, May," and pointed to a diamond stud in his tie, a diamond ring on his finger. I took them from him. Disturbed over telephone call. Mrs. Munns said she could offer no explanation of the slaying, but she recalled that late Saturday night, Burke had received a telephone call from Cleveland and that after talking irritably with the person in Cleveland, had seemed nervous. He said today that he hadn't slept well, she added. In the post-mortem examination by coroner's physician Dwayne Ritchie at the morgue, it was found that a bullet from a .38 caliber pistol had lodged in Burke's abdomen. The other bullet from a .45 caliber pistol had entered his left side, passing through the heart, and emerged through the right side of the back. Close quote. The Pittsburgh Press would also weigh in on the possible motive. At the center of the dispute was a large interstate whiskey transaction. Burke was one of 4 men who conspired with an Ohio-based wholesale drug firm in a deal involving 2,000 cases of whiskey worth approximately $250,000. The shipment was ostensibly intended for medicinal bottling, perfectly legal under tightly regulated permits. Instead, according to federal charges, the liquor was diverted into Burke's bootlegging operation and sold at illicit prices. This was not a small side arrangement, that was a wholesale scale. The press framed it this way. Quote, according to persons who know the Akron men who were sentenced, Lynn, Martino, and Madeline accused Burke of double-crossing them in the deal, which involved 2,000 cases of whiskey, which the government charged was secured unlawfully from a distillery. Instead of them sharing in the profits amounting to many thousands of dollars through the sale of the whiskey at bootleg prices, it is alleged Lynn, Martino, and Madeline were bilked by the Pittsburgher. They charged that Burke took over all the profits accruing from the illicit deal. Close quote. If that account is accurate, this is no longer just a case of a man who might peach. It is about betrayal. 2,000 cases, $250,000 in product, interstate partners already serving prison time, and a man in Pittsburgh allegedly keeping the lion's share. In the emerging bootleg economy, that is not merely bad business, it's an offense that demands correction and death. The Pittsburgh Press did not soften its language about the men involved in this trade. It wrote, quote, they are desperate men watching and suspecting one another and ready, as the Burke murder shows, to kill one another at the least sign of treachery. If federal law officers cannot or will not unaided enforce prohibition, a growing dislike for the risk of the bootlegging game, including assassination, may help them. Close quote. The implication is clear. If the courts cannot discipline the market will discipline itself. Betrayals of partners is common and the penalty is death. Money becomes the new god. And in January of 1923, that discipline arrives at 200 South Fairmont Avenue. Police did not view Burke's murder as an isolated act. According to the Pittsburgh Press, there was concern that the violence would not stop with him. Quote, since Burke's taking the throne as Bootleg King when the dry law was enacted, 2 of his lieutenants had been killed in attempting to smuggle whiskey through the cities of Cleveland and Chicago. One of them was the husband of his housekeeper. He was slain in Cleveland when he failed to stop a truck which police say was loaded with whiskey when they commanded him to halt. Close quote. This is not a sudden eruption of violence. It's a pattern. Cleveland, Chicago, interstate shipments, armed transport, dead lieutenants. One of them, the husband of the very woman sitting upstairs with Burke moments before the doorbell rang. His network is already bleeding. And if Burke truly took the throne as the paper describes, then his assassination is not merely personal, it is structural. A struggle over territory, profit, and control stretching beyond Pittsburgh's city limits. Police move quickly in the days that follow. Orders are issued to watch railway stations. Officers scan the streets and highways for Ohio license plates, focusing on the partial numerals reported near the scene. Detectives fan out, attempting to trace the cars seen speeding from Fairmont Avenue towards Penn Avenue. But even as they search, uncertainty grows. In speaking with the press, Captain Leff makes clear how complicated the situation has become. Quote, Captain Leff said that as the investigation progresses, the mystery develops more and more intricate problems and leads. It is the intricateness of this combination that is proving most puzzling. It is pointed out that Burke has made many enemies in his career as an alleged bootlegger, any one of whom might be suspected of having connection with his murder. Close quote. That's the reality. Too many enemies, too many deals, too many cities. Cleveland partners who may have felt betrayed, Chicago connections tied to smuggling routes, local rivals watching an empire wobble. In a trade built on secrecy, loyalty, and enormous sums of money, betrayal, real or suspected, multiplies the suspects. The mystery does not narrow, it widens. Still, as with Gregorio Conti in the last episode, the death does not end the argument. It begins another one. Even as detectives speak of enemies and intricate combinations of leads, there are those who step forward to defend Martin Burke's name. His niece does not recognize the man described in the headlines. Speaking to the Pittsburgh press, she pushes back forcefully against the narrative forming around him.
When people say Martin Burke had enemies and was disliked, they do not tell the truth. I have made my home with him about 15 years, and I never knew him to be unkind or impatient with anyone, and I never knew anyone to be against him. I don't believe he had the enemies some people say he had. When he took over that beautiful big home in Atlantic City, I was put in charge of it, and he used to be so glad to come down and see us. Everybody who worked for him loved him, for he always was kind. It hurts me to hear people say he had enemies, when I don't believe he had. When he had the saloon in Wiley Avenue, prior to Prohibition, everybody loved him, for he always was ready to help anyone who needed it. He was in a rough neighborhood, but nobody ever hurt him. He was my mother's brother, and was good to me, and I want to speak for him now that he isn't able to speak for himself. They say he made his money in bootlegging. That isn't true. He saved his money, and he was wealthy before Prohibition ever came.
In the weeks that follow, another layer of the story becomes public, the money. Reports of Burke's estate value it at somewhere between $350,000 and $1.5 million, the modern equivalent of roughly $6.6 million to $28.4 million. However one measures it, the scale is unmistakable. Prohibition had not merely sustained him, it had multiplied him. 11 members of his family are named as heirs, and then 3 months after the killing, the story takes another turn. If you remember, his housekeeper, Mrs. May Munns, the same housekeeper who was in the home the night Burke was shot, steps forward, claiming to be his widow, seeking her share of the estate. What follows is a protracted legal battle. The family disputes her claim. The courts examine the evidence. Perhaps they were in a relationship, perhaps not. The legal evidence doesn't support her claim, and though she fights hard for her piece of the action, in the end, Munns loses. She's not recognized as his widow and receives nothing from the estate. The estate fight does not prove anything about the murder, but it does illuminate the scale of what was at stake. This is not a modest saloon keeper's fortune. This is generational wealth built in the first years of Prohibition. His niece insists he was kind, that he had no enemies, that his wealth predated the dry law. The newspapers describe a man who, quote, made $1 million in bootlegging whiskey, who was accused of double-crossing partners, and who was killed on the eve of prison. Both portraits can exist. Both things can be true, and somewhere between them stands the reality of Martin Burke, ward politician, saloon keeper, bootleg wholesaler, millionaire, and victim of a carefully timed and planned execution. Prohibition did not simply create criminals, it created fortunes, and fortunes attracted gravity. In the end, Burke's killers are never brought to justice. His short reign in the first years of Prohibition ends on that cold evening at the doorstep of 200 South Fairmont Avenue. His death certificate, though difficult to read, states it clinically, quote, shock and hemorrhage following gunshot wounds of chest and abdomen through heart and lungs. Murder. That is how the record remembers him. Burke had become Pittsburgh's so-called Bootleg King in the earliest wave of the dry era. Though he did his business in the Hill District, his operations stretched into Cleveland and Chicago, interstate scale, medicinal fronts, wholesale diversion, big money. And then 6 days after conviction, 1 day before prison, he is gone. But here's the thing. In Prohibition America, this kind of ending is not rare. In fact, as Prohibition goes on, it becomes more and more common. This death reminds me of the final line in the movie A Bronx Tale.
And I learned the greatest gift of all. The saddest thing in life is wasted talent. And the choices that you make will shape your life forever. But you can ask anybody from my neighborhood, and they'll just tell you, this is just another Bronx Tale.
And in Pittsburgh in the 1920s, Burke's death is not treated as a singular tragedy. It's absorbed. Another headline, another shooting, another man who rose fast and fell faster. Just another bootlegging tale. And the city moves on because Prohibition doesn't slow for funerals. Burke's death leaves a void, but the vacuum fills almost immediately. For much of the 1920s, Pittsburgh's newspapers read like dispatches from a battlefield. Detectives and bootleggers are shot during thrilling battle in street. Liquor cars guard offered $10,000 bribe. Rum runners in gunfight over invasion of districts. Booze robbers prey on whiskey crooks. Pittsburgh has modern version of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. Bootleggers kill deputy. 2 of gang wounded. 7th gang war victim slain after midnight ride. 2 men are slain in gang war here. Victim of gang feud dies. Mum about assassins. This is organized chaos. Bootleggers hijack shipments, bribe police, wage running gun battles through the city streets, and the violence does not stop at the city lines. It spills outward into New Kensington, Arnold, Wilkinsburg, McKees Rocks, Wilmerding, Braddock, and elsewhere. Between 1926 and 1933, Allegheny County records more than 200 gang-related murders. That is not a brief fad, that is a sustained conflict. The men who survive this environment evolve, they consolidate, they learn discipline, and they build structure. Prohibition becomes their education, an Ivy League in logistics, enforcement, loyalty, and profit. And eventually, out of that chaos, a different kind of operator steps forward. Not merely a bootlegger, a consolidator, a power broker, a man whose name we have been circling around for several episodes. Finally, we're going to get to Stefano Monastero. His rise, his consolidation, his fall. But that is a story for another day. Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support the show more directly, get access to ad-free episodes, exclusive content, and behind-the-scenes extras, head on over to my Patreon and consider becoming a capo. It's just $5 per month, and it's a low-pressure way to show your support in order to keep the podcast going strong. Every little bit of support means a lot. For a full bibliography of the primary and secondary sources consulted in the making of this episode, visit ganglandhistorypodcast.com. Until next time, May your envelopes be heavy and your troubles light. Goodbye, everybody.